Why do the chronicles of hardened Saracen warriors, men who lived and breathed battle, describe the charge of a handful of Templar knights not as a military maneuver, but as a supernatural disaster? And how did an order founded by just 9 men, so poor they allegedly shared a single horse, transform in less than a human lifetime into a financial entity capable of bankrolling the wars of entire kingdoms? These are not questions for mythologists. They are questions for intelligence analysts and financial auditors. The official story, the one carved in stone and parchment, speaks of piety and sacrifice. But the truth, whispered in the ledgers of their private banks and written in the blood-soaked sand of Palestine, is far more shocking. The Knights Templar were not merely soldiers of Christ. They were the architects of a new world order, forged in holy fire and secured with the cold logic of capital. Their story begins not with a prayer, but with a blade and a calculated, terrifying understanding of human fear. In the year 1177, near the ancient city of Ramla, the fate of the Crusader kingdom hung by a thread. The brilliant Sultan Saladin, the unifier of Islam, had brought an army of 26,000 professional soldiers to crush the tiny kingdom of Jerusalem once and for all. Facing him was a desperate, cobbled-together force of a few thousand, led by a 16-year-old boy king afflicted with leprosy, Baldwin IV. By any military calculation, it was not a battle, it was an execution. But among the Christian ranks were 80 Templar knights. 80. It sounds like nothing, a rounding error in the face of Saladin's horde. Yet, when the Christian lines began to buckle, these 80 men did the unthinkable. Following their grandmaster, Odo of Saint-Amand, they lowered their lances and charged directly into the heart of the Saracen army. This was not courage as other men understood it. It was a violation of the laws of war, of physics, of sanity itself. The Templar battle tactic, the famous wedge charge, was a thing of brutal simplicity and terrifying effectiveness. A small, dense triangle of the most heavily armored knights on the planet, moving as one organism, accelerated to a bone-shattering velocity. They did not flow around the enemy, they punched through them. Saracen accounts describe the impact as a thunderclap, a force that did not kill men so much as erase them. Behind the steel tip of the wedge, the supporting knights widened the breach, their longswords reaping a harvest of limbs and lives. They were trained to ignore the dying, to step over the wounded, to focus only on a single objective: the enemy commander. They moved in unnatural silence, their vows forbidding battle cries. The only sounds were the thunder of hooves, the splintering of shields, and the wet crack of breaking bone. At the Battle of Montcussard, this wedge of 80 knights, supported by a few hundred other horsemen, shattered Saladin's personal guard and sent the Sultan himself fleeing for his life. The 26,000-man army dissolved into a panicked mob. It was a victory so total, so disproportionate, that it could not be explained by tactics alone. It cemented the legend of the Templars. They were not just elite soldiers, they were God's judgment made manifest in steel. This reputation became their greatest weapon. They were forbidden by their own sacred rule from retreating unless outnumbered more than 3 to 1. Think about that. A Templar knight was not allowed to take a single step back unless he was facing at least 4 enemies personally. This wasn't a guideline, it was a sacred oath. Breaking it meant expulsion from the order in disgrace, a fate worse than death. As a result, they simply didn't break. The order recruited the best, but it was their training that created the legend. A recruit spent years being systematically stripped of his identity. His name, his family, his wealth, all were surrendered. He was taught to think not as an individual, but as a cog in a flawless machine. Personal glory, the very thing that drove the secular knights of Europe, was a sin. A Templar fought not for fame, but for the order. This created a fighting force unlike any other. While feudal armies were collections of arrogant nobles squabbling over precedence, the Templars were a brotherhood of professionals. They drilled relentlessly. They mastered logistics. They understood that victory was won not in the final charge, but in the months of preparation, in the quality of the steel, the health of the horses, and the iron discipline of the men. They did not pray for victory. They were victory's prayer, answered in blood and iron. This lethal efficiency was a shock to the system of medieval warfare. The Templars were the first standing professional army in Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. They were always ready, always garrisoned, always funded. While kings had to beg and bargain with their vassals to raise an army for a single campaign, the Grand Master of the Temple could mobilize a force of disciplined killers with a single command. This gave them immense power. The kings of Jerusalem, perpetually weak and surrounded by enemies, became utterly dependent on them. The Templars were their shield, their sword, and, increasingly, their masters. They were granted castles, lands, and exemptions from all taxes and laws. They answered to no king, no bishop, only to the Pope in Rome. And they were ruthless. Their war in the Holy Land was not one of chivalrous jousts. It was a grim, grinding affair of raids, ambushes, and massacres. When they captured a fortress, they often put the entire garrison to the sword. They saw themselves as surgeons, cutting the cancer of Islam from the Holy Land. There was no room for sentiment. Their fanaticism was cold, calculated, and absolute. This terrified their enemies, but it also unnerved their friends. Imagine you are one of those crusader kings. You owe your crown, your life, to these silent warrior monks. But when you look into their eyes, you see no personal ambition, no greed, no fear. You see only the chilling certainty of their cause. Would you feel gratitude, or would you feel a deep, creeping dread? You have unleashed a weapon you cannot control. The order grew with astonishing speed. The victory at Montgisard was the greatest advertisement imaginable. Younger sons of noble houses, men with no inheritance but a sword and a thirst for purpose, flocked to their banner. With every new recruit came donations of land, of castles, of gold. Within 50 years of their founding, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon were, ironically, becoming one of the wealthiest institutions in Christendom. Their military might was the engine of this growth, but it was not the ultimate source of their power. The battlefield victories, the bloody charges, the piles of Saracen dead, these were merely the foundations. True power, the kind that lasts for centuries and shapes civilizations, is not built on steel alone. It is built on something far more subtle and far more revolutionary. It is built on control, and the Templars were about to teach the world a masterclass in what true control looked like. Their power was born on the battlefield, but it was nurtured on the long, dusty roads of the Holy Land. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was less a kingdom and more a fortified corridor, a fragile Christian beachhead on a hostile continent. Its lifeblood was the flow of pilgrims from Europe. These men and women were the source of coin, of new recruits, of political legitimacy. But the journey to Jerusalem was a passage through hell. From the moment a pilgrim stepped off the boat in Acre or Jaffa, he was prey. Bands of Bedouin raiders, disgruntled local lords and common bandits haunted every road, every mountain pass. To travel from the coast to the holy city was to gamble with your life and your soul. For the first Crusader kings, this was an unsolvable problem. Their forces were too small, the territory too vast and inhospitable. They could hold the cities, but they could not control the land between them. The Templars saw not a problem, but an opportunity. Their original mandate, their very reason for existence, was to protect these pilgrims. They took this duty and transformed it from a simple bodyguard service into a systematic science of territorial domination. They began by building a chain of fortifications along the main pilgrim routes. These were not the grand castles of European lords built for prestige and comfort. They were brutalist marvels of military engineering designed for one purpose: to project power into the surrounding landscape. Chastel-Pèlerin, or Château Pèlerin, built on the coast south of Haifa in the year 1218, was a prime example. Its outer wall was 50 feet high and 20 feet thick. It was flanked by two immense towers and built directly on the sea, allowing it to be resupplied by the Templar fleet, making it virtually impregnable to a land-based siege. From these stone fortresses, the Templars operated like a modern highway patrol, but with swords and lances. They sent out regular, heavily armed patrols. They established smaller watchtowers and way stations. They learned the terrain intimately, every wadi, every oasis, every hidden pass where an ambush might be laid. Their intelligence network was second to none. Local informers, grateful pilgrims, and even captured enemies were sources of information about bandit movements and enemy plans, and their response to any attack was swift and merciless. A caravan attacked on a Tuesday would often lead to a punitive Templar raid on the responsible tribe's encampment by Thursday. They did not seek justice, they imposed order. The message was simple and clear: the roads belong to the temple. Travel under their protection and you are safe. Challenge them and you will be erased. This security operation was not a charity. Pilgrims paid for protection, either with a direct fee or, more often, through a donation to the order. The Templars became the sole guarantors of safe passage, and this monopoly was the bedrock of their growing state within a state. They controlled the movement of people and goods, the essential arteries of the Crusader kingdom. With this control came immense influence. They decided which trade caravans received escorts, which nobles were granted safe passage through their territory. They built their own ports, their own farms, their own mills. They created a self-sufficient economic and military infrastructure that ran parallel to and was often more efficient than the kingdom's own. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was a border. The Templar network was a spine. Without it, the entire enterprise would have collapsed. Imagine the landscape of the Holy Land. It is a harsh, unforgiving place. The sun is a hammer, water is more precious than gold, and every shadow could hide an enemy. In this world, a Templar castle on the horizon was a symbol of absolute authority. Crac de Chevalier, though later controlled by the Hospitallers, was a perfect example of the type of fortress they commanded. A castle so vast it could hold a garrison of 2,000 soldiers and their horses, with supplies to withstand a siege for 5 years. From its ramparts you could see for miles in every direction. It was a man-made mountain of stone, a declaration in the language of power that this land was now under new management. For a weary pilgrim, it was a sanctuary, a vision of heaven. For a Saracen emir, it was a dagger pointed permanently at the heart of his territory. This network of castles required a constant flow of men, horses, and above all, money. Maintaining these garrisons in a state of permanent readiness was fantastically expensive. The Order's lands in the east were productive, but they could not possibly cover the costs of this massive military machine. The donations from Europe were generous but unpredictable. The Templars needed a system, a reliable, efficient, and revolutionary way to move wealth across the world. They were soldiers, administrators, and engineers of the highest caliber. Now they were about to become something else entirely, something far more powerful. They were about to become bankers, and the secret to this transformation lay buried, perhaps literally, beneath their feet, in the very place from which they took their name: the Temple of Solomon. The official headquarters of the Order was the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, located on the southern edge of the Temple Mount. The Crusaders believed it to be the site of Solomon's temple, and it was from this sacred location that the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon derived their name. For the first 9 years of their existence, from 1119 to 1128, the Order accepted almost no new members. The original 9 knights, led by Hugues de Péan, lived and worked in this compound, largely out of the public eye. Historians have long debated what they were doing during this period. Later, occult legends would claim they were searching for mystical artifacts, the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail. These stories make for thrilling fiction. The reality, however, is both less mystical and infinitely more astonishing. They were not digging for gold, they were mining for an idea. The true treasure the Templars discovered under the Temple Mount was not a physical object, but a concept. They were sitting atop the ruins of a civilization that had mastered large-scale administration and commerce. They were also in constant contact with the two most advanced economic cultures of the age, the Byzantine and the Islamic. They studied how these empires funded their armies, how they collected taxes, how they moved wealth across vast distances. And from this knowledge, they synthesized something entirely new, a financial innovation that would change the world more profoundly than any holy relic. They invented the first international banking system. Its genius lay in its simplicity. Imagine you are a French nobleman planning to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. In the 12th century, this was a logistical nightmare. You would have to carry a vast amount of gold and silver with you to cover your expenses for a journey that could take over a year. This made you a moving treasury, a magnet for every thief, pirate, and corrupt official between Paris and the Holy Land. The Templars offered a stunningly elegant solution. You would go to the Templar preceptory in Paris. There, you would deposit your treasure. In return, you would receive not a heavy chest of coins, but a single piece of parchment, a letter of credit. This letter would be inscribed with a detailed description of you and a complex cipher, a secret code known only to the order's treasurers. You would then travel to the Holy Land, carrying only this light, innocuous piece of parchment. When you arrived in Jerusalem and needed funds, you would present your letter at the Templar headquarters. The treasurer there would check the cipher, match your description, and give you the equivalent amount of cash from their local vaults. The system was revolutionary. It completely eliminated the risk of travel. It was the medieval equivalent of a traveler's check, an ATM card, and a Swiss bank account all rolled into one. Other orders sought the Holy Grail. The Templars understood the Holy Grail was credit. This service, initially offered to pilgrims, was quickly expanded. Soon, kings and merchants were using the Templars to move vast sums of money across Europe and the Mediterranean. This system was built on one crucial commodity: trust. Absolute, unshakable trust. And the Templars were uniquely positioned to provide it. Firstly, they were monks who had taken vows of poverty. Officially, they owned nothing personally, so they had no incentive to embezzle funds. Secondly, they were the most feared military force in the world. To rob a Templar courier or default on a Templar loan was not just a crime, it was suicide. They had the legal authority granted by the Pope and the military muscle to enforce any contract and collect any debt, anywhere in Christendom. They were the perfect combination of a holy order and a heavily armed collection agency. Their financial services grew in sophistication. They began offering deposit accounts, managing estates for absentee lords, and, most importantly, lending money. While the Church officially forbade usury, the charging of interest, the Templars found clever ways around it. They would structure loans as rental agreements or charge administrative fees and penalties for late payment. They became the bankers of choice for the perpetually cash-strapped monarchs and popes of Europe. When King Louis VII of France went on the Second Crusade, he entrusted the entire treasury of his kingdom to the Templars for safekeeping and management. They were no longer just soldiers protecting pilgrims. They were the central bankers of Christendom, the indispensable grease in the gears of the entire crusading enterprise. This financial empire, with its headquarters in the Temple of Paris and London, became the true source of their power. Their castles in the east were a drain on resources, a constant bloody struggle, but their financial network in the west was a fountain of limitless wealth. It allowed them to fund their wars, to build their fortresses, to operate with a degree of autonomy that no feudal lord could dream of. They had created a system that made them essential to everyone, from the humblest pilgrim to the most powerful king. But in doing so, they had also planted the seeds of their own destruction. They had become too rich, too powerful, and too independent. They were now servants of God and masters of mammon. And it is a very difficult thing to serve two masters, especially when one of them inspires such deadly envy in the hearts of men. Their success in the Holy Land was mirrored by an even more explosive expansion across Europe. By the mid-13th century, the Order owned vast tracts of land in nearly every country in Christendom. From the sheep farms of England to the vineyards of France and the ports of Italy, the white mantle with the red cross was a symbol not just of piety, but of immense economic power. Their network of commanderies, known as preceptories, numbered in the thousands. Each was a combination of a monastery, a military recruitment center, and a branch of an international bank. This network was the physical manifestation of their invisible empire, a state without geographical borders, its tendrils reaching into the highest echelons of every European court. The Templars were the ultimate medieval corporation, a multinational conglomerate with its own army, its own laws, and a direct line to the Pope that superseded the authority of any king. They were exempt from all local taxes. They could move goods and money across borders without paying tariffs. Their properties were considered sovereign territory, untouchable by local sheriffs or lords. In an age of fragmented feudal authority, they were a unified, centrally controlled organization with a clear command structure and a staggering amount of liquid capital. They were, in essence, the offshore zone of the Middle Ages, and their wealth grew exponentially. They managed the finances of queens, collected taxes on behalf of bishops, and provided the loans that funded the endless wars between England and France. This immense wealth and privilege inevitably began to change them, or at least the perception of them. The image of the poor knight sharing a horse was replaced by that of the arrogant Templar commander, clad in fine robes and dining with kings. Chroniclers of the period, often writing with a pen dipped in envy, began to speak of Templar pride. They were accused of greed, of dealing secretly with their Saracen enemies when it suited their commercial interests, of forgetting their sacred mission in the pursuit of profit. Could you remain true to a vow of poverty while managing a fortune greater than the treasury of all of Europe? The question hung in the air of every royal court, a toxic whisper that slowly began to poison their reputation. The truth was more complex. The vast majority of Templar brothers lived austere, disciplined lives as their rule demanded. The order's profits were not for the most part spent on personal luxury. They were ploughed back into the war effort in the East. The farms in France paid for the garrisons in the Levant. The loans made in London funded the construction of castles in Syria. The entire European operation was a massive logistical and financial machine designed to support the permanent crusade. But this was a nuance that was lost on their debtors. And their list of debtors included some of the most powerful men in the world. Kings borrowed their crowns from the temple. They just didn't realize the interest was their sovereignty. A king who owes his throne to a bank is not truly a king, he is a client. And by the late 13th century, many European monarchs were little more than clients of the Templar order. They resented it bitterly. They saw an organization within their own borders that was wealthier and more efficient than their own governments, an organization that paid them no taxes and answered none of their commands. The Templars had become a parallel power structure, one that challenged the very idea of national sovereignty that was just beginning to emerge. They were a relic of a universal Christendom in an age that was moving towards the nation-state. Their globalism was a threat to the new royalism. This growing tension was a silent, undeclared war, fought not on the battlefield, but in the council chambers and counting houses of Europe. The warrior monks had become masterful diplomats and shrewd financiers. They had to be, to navigate the treacherous currents of medieval politics. But every successful loan, every shrewd investment, every expansion of their power only deepened the resentment. They had created a system that the world depended on, but they had forgotten a crucial rule of human nature. No one loves their banker, especially not a banker who is also a holy warrior, accountable to no one but God. They were admired, they were feared, they were indispensable, but they were no longer loved. And in the Game of Thrones, fear without love is a dangerous currency. It can purchase obedience for a time, but its ultimate dividend is betrayal. Have you ever considered what truly corrupts a person or an entire institution? Is it the raw, naked exercise of power, the ability to command armies and topple thrones? Or is it the silent, creeping influence of wealth, the power to buy loyalty, to indebt kings and to shape the world, without ever drawing a sword? Let us know what you think in the comments. Your perspective is part of this story. Their enemies in Europe were hidden behind smiles and diplomatic courtesies. In the mountains of Syria, however, the Templars faced an enemy as secretive, as disciplined, and as deadly as they were. They were the Nizari Ismailis, a Shia sect that had carved out a state for itself in a series of remote mountain fortresses. To the Crusaders, and to the wider world, they were known by a more sinister name, the Assassins. Led by a mysterious figure known as the Old Man of the Mountain, the Assassins had perfected the art of political murder. Their agents, the fanatical Fidai, would infiltrate enemy courts and cities, sometimes for years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike down a targeted vizier, sultan, or crusader lord. They were the spectre that haunted the dreams of every ruler in the Middle East. The war between the Templars and the Assassins was not a war of armies clashing in open battle. It was a shadow war, a grim dance of espionage, infiltration, and targeted killing. It was a confrontation between the two most effective intelligence agencies of the medieval world. Both orders were secretive, hierarchical, and demanded absolute obedience from their members. Both inspired a mystical terror in their enemies. Both understood that a single, well-placed dagger could achieve what an entire army could not. The Assassins saw the Templars as the most dangerous and effective arm of the Crusader presence, a primary obstacle to their own ambitions. The Templars saw the Assassins as a destabilizing force, a network of fanatics whose actions threatened the delicate balance of power in the region. The chronicles are filled with tales of their lethal interactions. Conrad of Montferrat, the King of Jerusalem, was struck down in the streets of Tyre in 1192 by two assassins disguised as Christian monks. Suspicion immediately fell on their great rival, Richard the Lionheart, but many historians believe the true architect of the plot was the Old Man of the Mountain, Rashid ad-Din Sinan. The Templars, in turn, were not merely victims. They developed their own sophisticated counterintelligence network. They recruited agents from within the local populations, used their trade connections as cover for espionage, and became masters of discerning threats before they materialized. Their fortresses were not only military bases, but also centers for gathering and analyzing intelligence. The relationship was not, however, one of simple animosity. Beneath the surface of murder and intrigue, there was a strange, grudging respect. They were professionals, and they recognized in each other a shared dedication to their cause, a similar ruthlessness, and a mastery of the secret arts. There are even accounts of a bizarre form of diplomacy between them. The Assassins paid an annual tribute to the Templars for the right to operate in certain territories, a kind of medieval protection racket between two deadly mafias. Legend holds that the Grand Masters of the Temple and the Old Man of the Mountain sometimes communicated directly, sending envoys on secret missions to negotiate truces or even temporary alliances against a common enemy. Imagine such a meeting. Two men, each the absolute master of a secret society of trained killers, meeting in a torchlit room deep within a mountain fortress. They would speak not of God or paradise, but of power, of influence, of the strategic elimination of mutual inconveniences. These were not holy warriors. They were the spy masters of the 12th century, playing a lethal game for the control of the entire Middle East. This secret war taught the Templars invaluable lessons. They learned that the most important battles are not always fought with swords. They learned the value of information, the art of deception, and the necessity of absolute secrecy. These skills, honed in the shadow war against the Assassins, would serve them well in the political intrigues of Europe. But their dealings with the Assassins also fueled the darker rumors that swirled around them. Their enemies in Christendom whispered that the Templars were not just fighting the Saracens, they were learning from them. That their secrecy hid not just military plans, but heretical rites and unholy pacts. They were accused of a cynical pragmatism that placed the interests of the order above the interests of the faith. This accusation held a grain of truth. The Templars had been in the East for generations. They understood its complexities, its shifting alliances, its intricate web of power. They knew that survival sometimes required talking to your enemies, not just killing them. This pragmatism made them effective, but in an age of black and white fanaticism, it also made them suspect. They were becoming a hybrid entity, part Western knight, part Eastern potentate. And this strange fusion, which was the source of their strength in the Holy Land, would ultimately make them seem alien and terrifying to the very world they had sworn to protect. For all their intelligence, wealth, and discipline, the Templars were still men, subject to the same human flaws that plague all mortals: pride, ambition, and hatred. And in the summer of 1187, these passions would lead them, and the entire kingdom of Jerusalem, to the brink of annihilation. The Grand Master of the Order at the time was a man named Gerard de Riedefort. He was brave, charismatic, and a phenomenal warrior. He was also arrogant, rash, and consumed by a bitter personal feud with Raymond III, the Count of Tripoli. Raymond was the most powerful baron in the kingdom, a shrewd politician who advocated for a truce with Saladin, understanding the overwhelming power the Sultan now wielded. Gerard de Riedefort saw this as cowardice and possibly treason. He advocated for aggressive, preemptive war. Saladin, having unified Egypt, Syria, and much of Mesopotamia, was patient. He waited for the Crusaders to make a mistake. Gerard de Riedefort gave him the opening he needed. In violation of a truce that Raymond of Tripoli had painstakingly negotiated, a Templar-backed force led by Reynald of Châtillon attacked a massive Muslim caravan. It was a foolish and provocative act of banditry, and it gave Saladin the perfect justification to unleash his holy war. He gathered the largest army the Islamic world had seen in generations and crossed the Jordan River. The fate of the kingdom would be decided in a single, cataclysmic battle. The Crusader army, the entire fighting strength of the kingdom, assembled at Sephoria. They had water and they held a strong defensive position. Raymond of Tripoli, the most experienced commander, argued passionately to stay put. He knew Saladin's army was in a hot, dry region and would have to come to them crossing a waterless plain. He counseled patience. Let the Saracen army bake in the sun, let their discipline fray, and then attack. It was sound military advice. But Gerard de Riedefort saw it as a personal insult, another sign of Raymond's weakness. In a fateful war council held on the night of July 2nd, he stood before the hesitant King Guy of Lusignan and accused Raymond of being a traitor in Saladin's pay. He goaded the king, appealing to his honor and his piety, urging an immediate, glorious attack. He promised a victory that would echo through the ages. Tragically, the king listened to him. On the morning of July 3rd, the Crusader army marched out of its safe encampment and into a trap of God's own making. They were marching towards the Sea of Galilee, but between them and the water lay 15 miles of arid, sun-scorched terrain. Saladin's light cavalry swarmed around them like wasps, peppering them with arrows, cutting off stragglers, never engaging in a full battle. The Crusader knights, encased in their iron armor, began to cook alive. The infantry, choking on dust, their waterskins long empty, began to falter. By nightfall, they had made it only halfway. They camped on a dry, rocky slope, surrounded, tormented by thirst, with the glittering waters of the lake visible in the distance, cruelly out of reach. That night, Saladin's men set fire to the dry brush surrounding the camp, choking the Christians with smoke. Morale collapsed. The next day, July 4th, was a scene from hell. The battle took place near two rocky hills known as the Horns of Hattin. The Crusader infantry, maddened by thirst, broke ranks and tried to make a desperate push towards the lake. They were cut down in droves. The knights, exhausted and dehydrated, could barely lift their swords. Yet the Templars and Hospitallers fought with the terrifying courage of despair. They launched charge after charge up the hill towards Saladin's personal command post, trying to salvage the disaster by killing the Sultan. They almost succeeded, but it was hopeless. The army was shattered, surrounded, and utterly defeated. By the end of the day, nearly the entire military force of the Kingdom of Jerusalem had been killed or captured. King Guy was captured, Reynald of Châtillon was personally executed by Saladin, and Gerard de Riedefort was taken prisoner. In a final, chilling act, Saladin offered the captured Templar and Hospitaller knights a choice: convert to Islam and live, or remain Christian and die. To a man, they chose martyrdom. 230 knights were led to a hill and beheaded one by one. It was a devastating blow, a massacre from which the military orders would never fully recover. The Battle of Hattin was not just a military defeat, it was a judgment. It was the price of arrogance, the consequence of allowing personal hatred to override strategic sense. The Templars, the epitome of military discipline, had been led to disaster by an undisciplined master. Their invincibility was shattered, and in the weeks that followed, the undefended cities of the kingdom, including the holy city of Jerusalem itself, fell one by one to Saladin's victorious army. The dream of the Crusades was turning into a nightmare. The catastrophic loss at Hattin and the subsequent fall of Jerusalem sent a shockwave across Europe. The West, which had grown complacent, was stunned into action. The Pope called for a new crusade, the Third, and the three most powerful monarchs in Christendom answered the call: the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, King Philip II of France, and King Richard I of England, known to history as the Lionheart. It was to be the Crusade of Kings, a clash of titans destined to decide the fate of the Holy Land. But behind these larger-than-life royal figures, a quieter, more pragmatic force was at work. The Knights Templar, though decimated at Hattin, were far from finished. They would play a pivotal role in this new war, not just as elite warriors, but as financiers, strategists, and a crucial third force in the epic rivalry between Richard and Saladin. The Third Crusade began with its own disaster. Frederick Barbarossa, leading a massive German army, drowned while crossing a river in Anatolia, and his force disintegrated. This left Richard and Philip to lead the campaign. Their first objective was the port city of Acre, which had been under siege by the remnants of the Crusader forces, led by the captured and ransomed King Guy, for 2 years. The arrival of the English and French armies, with their advanced siege technology, finally broke the stalemate. Acre fell in the summer of 1191. It was a brutal, bloody affair culminating in Richard's infamous massacre of 3,000 Muslim prisoners. The crusade had begun in earnest. The Templars were at the heart of this new phase of the war. Their wealth was indispensable. Richard the Lionheart's campaign was fantastically expensive, and it was the Templars who provided much of the financing, acting as the paymasters for his army. Their commanderies in Europe gathered funds and transferred them to the east, allowing Richard to keep his mercenary soldiers in the field. But their contribution was more than financial. The surviving Templar Knights were the most experienced veterans in the Holy Land. They knew the terrain, they understood the enemy, and they provided Richard with his best scouts and most reliable heavy cavalry. The new Grand Master, Robert de Sablé, a close friend of Richard's, became one of the king's most trusted military advisors. What followed was a remarkable 2-year campaign, a grand strategic chess match between two of the greatest military commanders of the Middle Ages. It was not a war of conquest. Richard knew he lacked the manpower to retake and hold Jerusalem. It was a war of maneuver, of raids and counter-raids, of battles won through discipline and lost through impatience. Throughout this conflict, the Templars were Richard's iron core. At the Battle of Arsuf, it was a charge by the Hospitallers and Templars that shattered Saladin's flanking maneuver and secured a crucial victory for the Crusaders, solidifying their control of the coast. However, the Templars were not simply Richard's loyal soldiers. They were an independent power with their own long-term objectives. Their goal was not a single, glorious victory, but the sustainable survival of a Christian state in the Levant. They knew that kings like Richard would eventually go home. The Templars would have to remain, to live next to the Saracens, to manage the fragile peace that would inevitably follow the war. Consequently, while they fought fiercely for Richard, they also engaged in their own secret diplomacy. Their agents maintained contacts within Saladin's court, seeking a negotiated settlement that would guarantee the order's castles and lands, regardless of what the kings decided. This made them indispensable, but also suspect. Were they fighting for the cross or for the order? It was a question that even their allies began to ask. Imagine you are Richard the Lionheart. You are a brilliant warrior, the epitome of chivalry, but you are also hot-headed and impatient. Beside you stands the Grand Master of the Temple. He is calm, pragmatic, his advice always sound, his warriors always the most reliable. Yet you sense that he is playing a longer game than you are. He and his order are not just part of your army, they are a sovereign power that has lent you its services. Do you trust him completely, or do you watch him carefully, knowing his ultimate loyalty is not to your crown, but to his own mysterious organization? This was the complex dynamic at the heart of the Third Crusade. It was a temporary alliance of giants, each with their own ego, their own ambitions, and their own definition of victory. The Templars, ever pragmatic, sought a victory that could be sustained. For them, the war was not a glorious adventure. It was a permanent condition. The crusade ended not with a bang, but with a treaty. Richard, having marched to within sight of Jerusalem twice, ultimately recognized that he could not hold the city. He negotiated a 3-year truce with Saladin that left the coast in Crusader hands and guaranteed unarmed Christian pilgrims access to the holy sites. It was a practical, if unsatisfying, conclusion. Richard sailed for home, leaving the Templars and the other Crusader lords to pick up the pieces and manage the fragile peace. They had survived. They had even regained territory. But the great game was far from over. The kings had played their part, but the future of Outremer, the land beyond the sea, would once again rest in the hands of the military orders, the permanent guardians of a kingdom living on borrowed time. For a century after the Third Crusade, the Crusader states clung to life, a fragile strip of coastline centered on the heavily fortified city of Acre. This was the new capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a bustling, cosmopolitan port city, a kaleidoscope of Italian merchants, French barons, and the headquarters of the great military orders. But it was a city living on the edge of a volcano. The Islamic world, once fragmented, was now being consolidated under a new, terrifyingly efficient power, the Mamluks of Egypt. They were a dynasty of slave soldiers, the ultimate meritocracy of the sword, and their stated goal was the complete and final eradication of the Frankish presence in the Holy Land. One by one, the Crusader castles and cities began to fall. By the year 1291, only Acre remained. The siege of Acre in the spring of that year was the final desperate act in the 200-year drama of the Crusades. The Mamluk Sultan, Al-Ashraf Khalil, arrived with one of the largest armies ever assembled in the Middle Ages, with estimates running as high as 200,000 men. He brought with him a terrifying arsenal of siege engines, massive catapults that could hurl boulders capable of shattering stone walls. Defending the city was a mixed force of a few thousand knights and about 40,000 inhabitants. Command was divided, morale was low. Many of the wealthy nobles and merchants, seeing the writing on the wall, took their riches and fled by sea. The only forces truly committed to defending the city to the last man were the military orders, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, and above all, the Templars. What followed was 44 days of unrelenting hell. The Mamluk siege engines pounded the city's ancient walls day and night, a constant, deafening drumbeat of doom. The air was thick with dust and the stench of death. The defenders fought with savage bravery. They launched surprise sorties from the city gates, attempting to burn the enemy's siege weapons. They repaired the walls under a constant rain of arrows and stones. The Grand Master of the Temple, Guillaume de Beaujeu, a veteran of countless battles, led the defense. He was a stern, pragmatic commander, and he knew their situation was hopeless without reinforcements from the west. None came. The battle for Acre was a showcase of medieval siege warfare at its most brutal. The Mamluks were masters of sapping, digging tunnels under the city's walls and towers, propping them up with wooden beams, and then setting the beams on fire to collapse the fortifications above. The defenders dug countermines, leading to horrific underground battles fought in pitch darkness with picks and daggers. Every day the walls crumbled a little more. Every day the number of defenders grew smaller. On May the 18th, the Mamluks launched a final massive assault. They poured through a breach in the outer walls. The fighting moved into the streets of the city, a desperate house-to-house slaughter. Guillaume de Beaujeu, rushing to plug a gap in the defences, was struck by an arrow. His knights carried him back to the Templar compound. When they tried to rally him, saying the city could still be saved, he uttered his last, heartbreaking words, "I am not running away, I am dead." With his death, the last vestige of organized defense collapsed. The city fell into a chaos of massacre and pillage, but the Templars did not surrender. A few hundred of them, along with other knights and civilians, retreated into their own fortress, a massive fortified compound that stood on the edge of the sea. It was a fortress within a fortress, and from its walls they continued to fight. For 10 more days, this last bastion of Crusader power held out against the entire Mamluk army. The Sultan offered them safe conduct if they would surrender. They agreed, but when Mamluk soldiers entered the compound and began harassing the women and children, the Templars barred the gates and resumed the fight, killing the envoy. They had chosen to die. The Sultan, enraged, ordered a final assault. His engineers brought their mines under the main tower of the temple. As thousands of Mamluk soldiers swarmed up the buckling walls, the tower, its foundations destroyed, finally gave way. It collapsed in a monumental cloud of dust and rubble, killing not only the last of the Templar defenders, but also thousands of the Mamluk attackers who were scaling its walls. It was a final, defiant act of mutual destruction. With the fall of the temple, the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land was extinguished. The 200-year dream of a kingdom of God on earth had ended in blood and fire. The era of the Crusades was over. The few surviving Templars, who had escaped by boat from a smaller tower by the sea, carried with them the Order's treasury and its sacred banner. They were battered, defeated, and homeless. They had lost their home, their purpose, their very reason for being. Any other organization would have disintegrated, but the Templars were not any other organization. Their war in the Holy Land was over, but their story was not. Their invisible empire in Europe remained intact. They had lost their holy war, but they still possessed their wealth, their network, and their discipline. The question now was, what does a holy army do when it no longer has a holy war to fight? The answer would be a transformation as remarkable as their creation, a pivot from holy war to global commerce that would make them more powerful and more dangerous than ever before. The surviving brothers of the temple, a remnant of a once mighty army, made their way to the island of Cyprus. They were refugees, but they were the wealthiest refugees in history. Their escape from Acre was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one written not with the sword, but with the ledger and the shipping manifest. The Holy Land was lost, perhaps forever. The very purpose of the Order, to defend it, was now moot. Yet their vast infrastructure in Europe, the network of farms, preceptories, and financial offices, was untouched. It continued to generate immense revenue. The Templars were an army without a war, a body without a head. They needed a new base of operations and a new mission. They found their new home in Cyprus. In a shrewd political and financial move, they purchased the island, effectively becoming its sovereign rulers. Cyprus became the new headquarters of the Order, a Templar state in the heart of the Mediterranean. From here, they could dream of one day launching a new crusade to retake the Holy Land. But in the meantime, they had an island to run and a vast fortune to manage, and so the warrior monks underwent a stunning transformation. They became colonial administrators, merchants, and masters of the sea. Their pragmatism, honed over 2 centuries of survival in the East, came to the forefront. If they could no longer be the guardians of Jerusalem, They would become the gatekeepers of Mediterranean trade. The Templar fleet, once used to transport pilgrims and supply their castles, was expanded and repurposed. It became a powerful commercial and military navy that dominated the sea lanes of the eastern Mediterranean. Templar ships protected Christian merchant vessels from pirates for a fee. They transported valuable goods like sugar and spices from the Levant to the ports of Venice and Genoa. Some whispered that their definition of pirate was conveniently flexible, and that ships belonging to their commercial rivals often had a mysterious habit of disappearing at sea. Whether as protectors or predators, they became a major maritime power. The kings of Europe had once played at war by borrowing money. The Templars now owned the money by controlling the trade that fueled the European economy. On Cyprus, they ruled with ruthless efficiency. They managed the island's vast sugar plantations, using their logistical skills to maximize profits. Their administration was fair but firm, and they crushed any local dissent with the same cold discipline they had once applied to the battlefield. The island became an impregnable fortress and a bustling commercial hub, the forward base of their new maritime empire. Their wealth, no longer being consumed by the constant drain of war in the Holy Land, began to accumulate at an alarming rate. The temple in Paris became the largest and most secure repository of gold and silver in Europe, a de facto central bank for the entire continent. But something fundamental had changed. The original sacred purpose was gone. The defense of pilgrims, the liberation of the Holy Sepulchre, these were now distant memories, nostalgic justifications for an organization that had become, in essence, a massive, self-perpetuating corporation. Have they not become the very thing they once fought against? The Saracen merchants and emirs they had battled were, in many ways, men they now resembled, pragmatic, wealthy, and concerned with trade routes and profit margins. The fire of fanaticism had been replaced by the cold calculus of the balance sheet. This transformation made them incredibly powerful, but it also made them vulnerable. A holy warrior fighting for God is a difficult figure to attack politically. An international banker managing a vast fortune, however, is a very tempting target. While the Templars on Cyprus were building their new kingdom of commerce, the kings of Europe, particularly Philip IV of France, were watching with growing alarm and envy. Philip, known as the Fair, was a man of cold ambition and constant financial trouble. He saw the Templars not as heroes of the faith, but as a sovereign entity within his own kingdom, one that was obscenely wealthy and paid him no taxes. He owed them a fortune, and like many debtors, he began to dream not of repaying his loan, but of liquidating his creditor. The Templars had survived the Saracens, the Assassins, and the Mamluks, but they were about to face their most dangerous enemy yet, a bankrupt king with a team of clever lawyers and an utter lack of scruple. As the 14th century dawned, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon stood at the absolute zenith of their power. They were an invisible empire whose provinces were scattered across the map of Europe. Their headquarters in Paris was a formidable fortress, a city within a city that served as the financial heart of the continent. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was treated as a visiting head of state in the royal courts he visited. He commanded a private army that was still considered the most disciplined and effective in the world. The Templar fleet controlled key Mediterranean sea lanes. Their financial system was the bedrock of international commerce. They were, without exaggeration, the most powerful institution in the world, subordinate in theory only to a pope whose own finances they often managed. The order was planning a new, grand crusade. But this was not envisioned as another desperate expedition to the beleaguered coast of Palestine. It was a massive geopolitical project, a grand strategy for the reconquest and reorganization of the entire Eastern Mediterranean, to be funded and led by the Temple. They were no longer just a military arm of the Church, they were an independent global power with their own foreign policy. They had outgrown the very world that had created them. They were a transnational entity in an age of rising nationalism, a state without borders that challenged the authority of kings who were trying to consolidate power within their own territories. They had become too strong, too wealthy, too independent, and therefore they had become a threat. Imagine you are a king, you rule a kingdom, but within that kingdom is an organization that is richer than you, that has a better army, that is exempt from your laws and to whom you are deeply in debt. Its leaders answer to a distant pope, and their loyalty is to their own global order, not to your national crown. Would you see them as allies? Or would you see them as a cancer, a state within a state that must be excised before it consumes you? For King Philip the Fair of France, the answer was clear. The Templars were an intolerable obstacle to his vision of a centralized, absolute monarchy. Their existence was a challenge to his power, and their wealth was the solution to his bankruptcy. The storm gathered with terrifying speed. Philip, aided by his ruthless minister Guillaume de Nogaret, began to prepare a secret, meticulously planned operation. They used the same tools the Templars themselves had mastered: intelligence, secrecy, and overwhelming force. A campaign of disinformation was launched, with dark rumors spread through the court and the clergy. Whispers of heresy, of blasphemous secret rites, of idol worship, of institutionalized sodomy within the order. These were the same kinds of baseless accusations that had been leveled against unpopular groups for centuries, but they were deployed with chilling precision. The ground was being prepared for a public that would be shocked, but not entirely surprised, by what was to come. The Templars, for all their intelligence networks and political acumen, seemed oblivious. Perhaps they had become complacent, secure in their power and their papal protection. Perhaps they simply could not conceive that a Christian king would dare to move against the soldiers of Christ. They saw the gathering clouds, but they believed they were strong enough to withstand any storm. They failed to understand that the rules of the game had changed. The world of universal Christendom that had given birth to them was dying. A new world of sovereign nations, of absolute kings, and of ruthless state power was being born. The Templars were a magnificent, fearsome dinosaur, perfectly adapted to a world that was rapidly vanishing. On Friday, the 13th of October, in the year 1307, the axe would fall. But this is not a story about their fall. This is a story about the dizzying, terrifying peak from which they were pushed. It is a testament to the fact that when an organization becomes more powerful than the state will eventually seek to destroy it. The Knights Templar created the first global system that combined military might and financial capital, a structure that outgrew both states and the church. They were destroyed, but their model, the blueprint for a power accountable to no one but itself, remains. Now look at our modern world, at the forces that shape our lives. What, in your opinion, poses a greater threat today? An army subservient to a fanatical ideology, or a transnational corporation subservient to no one? Write your answer in the comments. Your opinion is the next chapter in this enduring story.